It is a very serious matter when a foreign country, in this case United States, tries to usurp certain powers over other countries and the citizens or the people, permanent residents of those countries. That is what's before us.
We have a number of very, I think, well-informed, interesting speakers here today. We'll be going, the first speaker that you'll hear from in a few minutes will be from the Canadian Civil Liberties Union, a lawyer by the name of Abby Deshman. But prior to that, she has asked that the basic stage be set in the form of a bare bones, rudimentary understanding of what FATCA is, of what it is we're actually dealing with, why it's important, because I tell you that if you can confidently say in 5 to 10 minutes that you understand it better from what I'm about to say, then either I've done a great job or you are an awesome audience or both. But the beginning of it really is the concept of citizenship-based taxation. Now, Mr. Stevens referred to U.S. citizens in his opening remarks. The term is actually U.S. persons. What does that mean? Well, the truth is it means anybody the U.S. says is a U.S. person, plain and simple. But it would include, obviously, it would include U.S. citizens, but it goes far more. Now remember that to include U.S. citizens, dual citizenship is incredibly common. How many people in this room have dual citizenship or look at that? Very common. In a global world, possibly becoming the rule even rather than the exception. So the term U.S. citizens, bottom line is, nobody knows for sure how many so-called U.S. citizens are in Canada. Nobody's ever challenged the figure of 1 million. But it's also reasonable to presume that the vast majority of those people are also Canadian citizens and have been for many years. Many of whom even, in fact, have been born here, and some of whom even don't even know that they're defined by the U.S. government as U.S. persons. Any snowbirds here? Well, that's because you're already gone. Probably. Because if you were, the U.S. government would say to you that if you spend too much time in the U.S. in any given year, that you're also going to be a U.S. person. Imagine the shock of discovering that on your way back from Florida reading the paper and what that might mean. Ever hear the phrase green card? I don't know if it really is green or not.
It's not green, it's off-white with a little green strip on the back.
Yeah. Awesome. Apparently this so-called green card is off-white. But what it is it's the thing that documents that you have a legal status of being a permanent resident of the U.S. And that, by the way, is something that goes on longer than you might think it does. In fact, there are many people who are green card holders who have not lived in the United States for many years. So what we're looking at, now the U.S. tax system, although it's in a more colloquial sense referred to as citizenship-based taxation, is actually U.S. person-based taxation, regardless of where that defined U.S. person resides in the world, including, by the way, Canada. Okay. Regardless of whether they have any remaining ties to the United States, property, anything, family, anything, it makes no difference. And this is a concept that is really quite foreign to most people's idea of how taxation works, because the truth of the matter is that there are only 2 countries at the present time in the world who tax people who live in other countries. Okay? Most countries, the overwhelming majority, tax, they say, well, you know, you live in the country, you got to pay the taxes because you got the services and it's part of being in the community. The U.S. says, no. If you were born in the U.S., if you're a U.S. person for any purpose, you have to pay taxes. FATCA is not a statute by itself. It stands, by the way, for Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. Now, in its simplest terms, and this is the challenge, I was talking to Professor Christians outside in the hall, this is the challenge to actually explain what in God's name this is, other than a permanent revenue source for the legal and accounting community. Now, as Mr. Stevens points out, the first thing FATCA is a law that is designed to apply extraterritorially. Now, in people talk, that means, you know, in the same way that the U.S. is sending drones into sovereign airspace once a week, they're also sending their laws into sovereign countries. In this case, this law has two distinct components to it without getting into too much of the detail of either one. The first is, it applies to, I'm just going to say the Canadian banks, although more is involved. That's because everybody can visualize a bank, the Canadian banks. Now here's what it's telling the Canadian banks. Okay, it's telling the Canadian banks, you know what? Okay, here's what we are asking you to do. We are asking you to take proactive steps at your expense to root through your databases and determine and identify anybody who's using your bank who meets our definition of U.S. person. And that, by the way, would include your friends, neighbors, and I suspect maybe some of the people in this room. If you don't enter into this agreement with the IRS, what they are saying is, now listen to me carefully because I think this is put far too charitably in the media. Any payment in U.S. dollars going to your Canadian bank, notice I'm not talking about profits, right? Am I right on that?
From anywhere.
From anywhere. Glad to have your vote on that. But no, it's interesting to me that I think that people undershoot the mark.
Oh,
You
yeah.
agree when they describe
Oh, yeah.
any payment.
Anything.
Are you ready? We're going to deduct 30%. Well, let's just imagine. Now, and by the way, this is to the bank irrespective of the account holder. All right? Are you getting what I'm saying? So in other words, okay, again, I'm going to put this again. If the bank does not sign the agreement with the IRS, any payment in U.S. dollars, regardless of the reason, and regardless of who the ultimate payee, is going to be subject to a 30% courtesy deduction.
What in these regulations raises privacy concerns? So much, so much. So if you look at how broad these regulations are, we got a sense of what U.S. persons are. U.S. persons, definitely citizens, former green card holders, people who spend time in the United States. Most of them will not know that they're U.S. persons. If the banks are required to report on this, what does that actually look like for Canadians walking into a bank, opening a bank account, trying to get banking services? What does that mandate Canadian banks? What information does that mandate them to collect about Canadians? Now, right now, they do not need to know when you open a bank account how many months you spent in the U.S. last year. Have you ever worked in the U.S.? Do you have a property in the U.S.? Do you get U.S. income? They don't need to know that. And it's actually required based on really simple identification. You're a resident of Canada, you can open a bank account. It's a really essential part of living in this society we live in. Try and live without a bank account or any of the financial institutions, because it's broader than just banks. It's extremely difficult. So when we're talking about privacy, if you just look at this, it could mandate, and this is part of what I'll get to later, it could mandate a really searching inquiry by the banks to try and figure out if you're a U.S. person. What they need to know could be extremely broad. We're seeing all kinds of areas where there is enormous information sharing going on between Canada and other countries. And we know from past instances that that when information is shared across borders, it loses all kinds of protections. It's that the United States is extremely interested in collecting information from all kinds of sources. They have enormous information databases, they have enormous surveillance programs, they have warrantless access to all kinds of communication coming inside and out of the US. And it's not because each of these emails, each of these small pieces of information is incredibly important to them. It's because when you collect all the data, when you collect who you're talking to, when you're talking to, what bank accounts you have, how long did you spend in the US last year, how long did you spend in other countries, where did you go to school, where were you born? When you collate all of that information, it allows for an analysis. And it allows for analysis by security agents, it allows for analysis by government agents, and it's this metadata that allows people to build these profiles about millions of individuals. There's no reason that the US government needs all this information on Canadians, and there is absolutely no reason that the Canadian government should acquiesce and give all of this information over.
Canada has Know Your Customer / anti-money laundering regulations. So every bank is supposed to know who opens an account, right? So they ask you for information. They will ask you for an address. Okay, they have your address, right? Then they give you an account number. Now under PIPEDA, however you say that here, PIPEDA is your privacy protection, right? That's what you look to say, what can Canada do with the information, with my private information? And the answer is that PIPEDA authorizes banks to give your financial information, which could include your name, your social insurance number, your account number, and include and money that you get in the account, you know, income in the account, to the Canadian Revenue Agency. But as against all others, no. So, if your bank, for example, was to send me a letter about your account, you would sue the bank under PIPEDA for a violation of your privacy, and you would be entitled to damages against the bank for disclosing it to me. So, the answer is that under FATCA, your bank is going to bring you a form and say, waive your rights to PIPEDA. And if you don't, closing your account.
This is not yet begun in Canada, but US persons in Europe, especially Switzerland, are in a position where they've been long-time customers of banks. These are people who live in Switzerland and are just trying to live their lives the way you and I do. It is not possible to live a life without a credit card, without a bank account, etc., etc. And they are simply being told, enough is enough, out. Okay, on an administrative level, they don't want to deal with US citizens because of the cost and because of the fear thing. But in this particular case, if FATCA becomes a reality in Canada, in the way that the US is proposing, what that will mean will be that if a bank determines that somebody is a US person,
Could be
a US person, they will then be given this form and asked to waive their rights. If they do not, FATCA requires the bank to close the account.
Right.
So essentially, one effect of this is to create a whole class of people who will be permanently disabled from normal day-to-day living. And that's leaving aside the issues of retirement planning and saving that I alluded to earlier.
You don't actually have to be a US person to lose your right to bank in Canada. You only have to have an indicia of possible US personhood, which means if you were born in the United States, you could be a US person, your account is subject to closure. Even if you're not, in fact, and there is no way to litigate this, there is no way to protest, there's no forum to go to your bank and say, wait, don't close my account. You can't do it. They've tied their own hands. They will close your account on suspicion that you might be a US person, and that includes, you should look at the list, the indicia list. I think you might be quite surprised to see how broad that is, and when you consider that it cannot be adjudicated, that is, there's no means of remedying a bad categorization. If someone makes a mistake and thinks you're a US person, There's no way to fix that problem.
And this is so reminiscent of so many other similar battles. So you think about no-fly lists, it's exactly the same thing. When we harmonize our transportation safety regulations, and we take on U.S. no-fly list requirements, the number of people that they have on that no-fly list is astounding. The lack of proof that they have that these people are actually risks to public safety, alarming, and no meaningful due process protections to try and get your name off that list. It is a black box, and if you are on it, you will not be flying over or into U.S. territory.
This is that same black box.
Yeah, exactly. So this is it's the same kind of thing. It is a complete downgrade of legal protections to really low standards internationally in an effort to harmonize our regulatory systems.
If you're a foreign financial institution, so here's our first acronym. If you're one of those, an FFI. So what is that? That's a bank, private equity fund, a hedge fund, a trust account holder, any number of entities that controls funds for others. If you're one of these, then what we want you to do, IRS, we want you to enter into an agreement with us, okay? The agreement is going to be something like a PFFI agreement, a participating foreign financial investment agreement. And in this agreement, you will agree to do this. That's level 1. So seek waivers from all of your identified U.S. accounts. We saw how that's done in the last video, that we're going to identify accounts. We can come back to some of the legal problems. There are many with that. But you decide who might be, could be, possibly a U.S. account. Put that red stamp on there, right? Could be, treated as. Doesn't matter if it actually is a U.S. person, only just if you think, have reason to believe it is. Put the stamp on it. Ask everyone with one of those to sign a waiver of their rights to their financial privacy in your institution. If they will not sign it, close the account. Now, if you sign the waiver, sign the waiver. Consent. So when you sign the waiver, you're doing two things. One, you're agreeing to give your bank any information it asks of you. And two, you're agreeing that your bank can disclose that to the IRS. Not to your government, not to the CRA, to the IRS. We're going to come back to that distinction in a minute. Okay, so you're going to give your info, you agree to give it, whatever they ask of you, for now until forever. Anything they ask you. What color underwear are you wearing? You have to tell them. Am I exaggerating? Not by the language of the statute. It says anything the secretary asks. They can ask you, and you will turn it over, and once one of those PFFIs is signed by your financial institution, they're agreeing that they will agree to give the IRS whatever else it asks, from now until forever. So it's not a closed agreement. In fact, we don't have any to look at. But the idea is, once signed, the secretary has carte blanche to ask the financial institution for anything, and they will go to you and ask you for that, and you've said you'll give it. You've agreed.
Let's be clear about something. FATCA is not like the World Trade Organization. It's not like NAFTA. It's not like the Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's not like any bilateral or multilateral international agreement where the various parties sit across the table as at least formal equals, even if they're not equal in terms of their bargaining power. If one side gets a better deal out of it than the other. It's not like that at all. It is a unilateral decision on the part of the United States. The Americans have made a demand. We must agree to the demand, because if we don't, they will punish us, but if we agree with it, the punishment will be somewhat lighter. The United States is threatening sanctions against Canada, one of our closest allies, trade partners, blah, blah, blah. But we are threatening a hostile act against this friendly country if they do not comply with the enforcement of an extraterritorial unilateral law. To avoid direct extraterritorial enforcement by the US on Canadian institutions, Canada instead can enforce this US law on itself. We'll just put a Canadian glove on the American hand, or fist, as the case may be. There's no nice way to call the IGA anything but a capitulation. So what this means in practice is, if an IGA is signed, that Canada would then enact domestic legislation, a kind of a FATCA-oid law, where under not American law, but Canadian law, would require Canadian institutions to supply basically all the information demanded by the IRS so they can just then scoot it over to their buddies in Washington. Unless an IGA is signed and unless domestic legislation is enacted to enforce it, a Canadian institution has a dilemma. Do I observe US law or Canadian law? Well, there's only one law they can follow unless there's an IGA, and that's Canadian law. It would be a violation of Canadian law. So as things stand, they cannot comply. There is no decision to be made unless your government capitulates, as it has shown every indication it wishes to do. So what this means is that the government is essentially engaged in a collusion with financial institutions against the rights of Canadian citizens under Canadian law. For example, we're talking about the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act that would be violated if the institution were to supply this information. What the United States is essentially saying to Canada is, look, we're reasonable people. We understand that you cannot comply with FATCA because it would violate your law. So we will generously allow you to change your law. In fact, we will generously allow you to change your law not to permit compliance with our unilateral demand, but to require compliance with our unilateral demand. We're reasonable people. These IGAs, which by the way are not in the FATCA law itself, there's nothing in the FATCA law itself. What happened was, as the law got passed, as I said, in the sort of the dead of night there, the Treasury Department gets it and said, oh my God, what are we going to do with this? We cannot possibly enforce this thing against every financial institution in the world and kick off a financial and possibly trade war in the process. What are we going to do? They were supposed to have published the draft regulations by the end of 2011. They didn't. They held on to them until February 8th when, by sheer coincidence, on the very same day, they released the joint statement with the 5 EU countries saying, oh, we're going to do this here partnership thing where they will enforce it on their own institutions and they don't have to go report directly to the IRS at all because they know that is the only thing that will make this work. We simply do not have the, we're big, we're bad, everybody's scared of us. We simply do not have the resources to actually enforce this against every institution in the world. The only way we can make this work is if we bamboozle enough foreign governments to go along with it themselves, and they know full well that they don't benefit from the deal, but they can kid themselves that they are at least being relieved of some of the cost and regulatory burden, and worst of all, they're being pushed by their own institutions to sign these IGAs. If Canada were to say no, a lot of other countries in the world would look at it and say, well, if the Yanks can't even get them on board, that means this is not going to fly. So that's why it is so crucial what happens up here. By the way, there seems to be some kind of an odd pro-American bias, especially among conservative parties, or at least parties that carry a conservative label that, oh, well, the Americans are good friends, et cetera, and, we really owe them a lot. I don't know what it is exactly, but we owe them a lot. And so we should go along with this, even when the thing you're going along with, it's not conservative, it's not progressive, it's just dumb. Is that the way a friend behaves? I mean, if I'm drunk and I say, hey, let's get in the car and go somewhere, does a friend jump in the car for a joyride, or does he take my keys away? A real friend says no under some circumstances. So I'm asking, as a Yank, I guess I'm not exactly a Yank, I live in Virginia.
Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners. And necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature has so joined together, let no man put asunder.